Welcome to Storytime with Mrs. Cole. Today we're going to finish up our reading of The Adventures of Peter Cottontail. Chapter 21. Happy Jack Squirrel is Too Busy to Talk. Peter Rabbit sat with his mouth wide open, staring up into the blue, blue sky, where old Mr. Buzzard was growing smaller and smaller. Finally, he was just a tiny, weeny speck, and then Peter couldn't see him at all. Peter hitched up his trousers and sat for a long time, looking very thoughtful. He was troubled in his mind, was Peter Rabbit. First Johnny Chuck had said, "I'll see you in the spring," and had disappeared underground. Then Grandfather Frog had said, "I'll see you in the spring," and had disappeared into the Smiling Pool. Now old Mr. Buzzard had said, "I'll see you in spring," and had disappeared up into the blue, blue sky. And they'd all spoke just as if they'd meant it. Peter said to himself, "I'll believe I'll go over and see Happy Jack Squirrel. Perhaps he can tell me what it all means." So off started Peter Rabbit, lippity, 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 through the green forest, looking for Happy Jack Squirrel. Pretty soon he caught a glimpse of Happy Jack's gray coat. "Hi, Happy Jack!" called Peter, hurrying as fast as he could. "Hello, Peter Rabbit! Don't bother me this morning. I've got too much to do to be bothered," said Happy Jack, digging a little hole in the ground while he talked. Peter grew curious at once, so curious that he forgot all about what he was going to ask Happy Jack. He sat down and watched Happy Jack put a nut in the hole and cover it up. Then Happy Jack hurried to dig another hole and do the same thing over again. "What are you doing that for?" asked Peter Rabbit. "Doing it for? Why, I'm getting ready for winter, of course, silly," said Happy Jack as he paused for breath. "But I thought you stored your nuts and corn in the hollow tree," exclaimed Peter Rabbit. "So I do," replied Happy Jack, "but I would be foolish to put all my supplies in one place, so I bury some of them." "But how do you remember where you bury them?" persisted Peter. "I don't always, but when I forget, my nose helps me out. Then I just dig them up and I get them," said Happy Jack. "Now I can't stop to talk any more. I'm late for this year, and the first thing I know, winter will be here." Then Peter remembered what he had come for. "Oh, Happy Jack, what did Johnny Chuck and Grandfather Frog and old Mr. Buzzard mean when they sang that they would see me in the spring?" he cried. "I can't stop to tell you now," replied Happy Jack, running this way and that way, and then pulling over the fallen leaves to hunt for another new nut. "Winter's coming, and I've got to be ready for it. Can't stop to talk." And that was all Peter Rabbit could get out of him, although he followed Happy Jack about and bothered him with questions until Happy Jack quite lost his temper. Peter sighed. He saw Chatterer the Red Squirrel and the Striped Chipmunk, both quite as busy as Happy Jack. It's as if no use to ask any of them, for they're doing the same thing that Happy Jack is, thought Peter. I don't see what use all the fuss is about winter. Anyway, I don't have to get ready for it. I believe I'll go down to the Smiling Pool again and see if Grandfather Frog maybe has come up. Chapter 22. Uncle Billy Possum Explains Things. Peter Rabbit sat still all day long in his safe hiding place in the middle of the dear old briar patch. Jolly round red sun had gone to bed behind the purple hills, and the black shadows had raced across the green meadows and into the green forest. Now the moonlight was driving them back a little way. Peter hopped out of the old briar patch into the moonlight and stretched first one leg and then the other. Then he jumped up and down 3 or 4 times to get the kinks out of his long hind legs, and finally started off up the lone line path, lippity, lippity, lippity. Halfway up the lone path, Peter Rabbit almost ran headlong into Uncle Billy Possum. "My goodness, Brother Rabbit, you done give me a powerful start," exclaimed Billy Possum. "What yo' doing right smart and hurry for?" Peter Rabbit grinned as he stopped running. "I didn't mean to frighten you, Uncle Billy Possum. The fact is, I was on my way up to your house to see you and old Mrs. Possum and all the children, to see how you're doing this fine fall weather," said Peter Rabbit. Uncle Billy Possum looked at Peter sharply. "Seems to me that you have taken a powerful sudden interest in we alls, and don't you remember seeing you up here for a long time, Br'er Rabbit," he said. Peter looked a little foolish. It was true that he hadn't been near Uncle Billy Possum's hollow tree for a long time. "You see, I've been very busy getting ready for winter," said Peter by way of an excuse. Uncle Billy began to chuckle and then to laugh. He rested both hands on his knees and laughed and laughed. Peter Rabbit couldn't see anything to laugh at, and he began to get just a wee bit provoked. "What's the joke?" he demanded. "The very idea, Brer Rabbit, getting ready for winter, or being busy about anything or any other people's affairs," cried Uncle Billy Possum, wiping his eyes. Peter tried to feel and look very angry, but he couldn't. No, sir, he couldn't. The very twinkle in Uncle Billy Possum's eyes made Peter want to laugh too. In fact, Peter just had to laugh. Finally, both stopped laughing, and Peter told Uncle Billy Possum all about the things that had troubled him. Johnny Chuck disappeared down in his house, and he said that he would see me in the spring. "What did he mean by that?" asked Peter Rabbit. "Just what he said," replied Uncle Billy. "He'd gone down into his bed and he'd gone to sleep. And he's going to stay that way till next spring." Peter's eyes looked as if they'd pop right out of his head. "And Grandfather Frog, what become of him?" he asked. "Oh, Grandfather Frog, he done go to sleep too. Down in the mud at the bottom of the Smiling Pool. I reckon you'll see Grandfather Frog come right up about springtime," said Uncle Billy. "And old Mr. Buzzard, he showed it down from the blue, blue sky that he would see me in spring. Has he gone to sleep up there?" asked Peter Rabbit. Uncle Billy Possum threw back his head and laughed fit to kill himself. "Bless your long ears, no, Brer Rabbit. No, indeed. My, oh, my, no. Brer Buzzard done flown away down south to old Virginny to stay away from the cold winter. And I most wish I was right along with him," added old Uncle Billy, suddenly growing sober. Then Peter Rabbit had a sudden thought. "You aren't going away to sleep all winter, are you, Uncle Billy?" he asked anxiously. The grin came back to Uncle Billy's face. "No, Brer Rabbit. I reckon you can find me right here in my hollow tree most any time this winter, and if you go knocking hard enough. But I don't reckon on going out too much, and I don't reckon I'm going to have a right smart lot to sleep." Chapter 23. Peter Rabbit has a bright idea. Peter Rabbit had a bright idea. At least, Peter thought it was, and he chuckled over it a great deal. The more he thought about it, the better it sounded. What was it? Why, to follow the plan of Johnny Chuck and Grandfather Frog to avoid the cold, stormy weather and to sleep all winter. Yes, sir, that was Peter Rabbit's bright idea. If Johnny Chuck can sleep and sleep through the long, stormy winter through, it might be something, seems to me, the very thing for me to do. Peter Rabbit said to himself, as he sat in the middle of the old briar patch, chewing on the end of some straw. If Johnny Chuck could do it, and of course he could do it, all he would have to do is to find a snug, warm house which no one else was using, fix him a comfortable bed, curl up into, and go to sleep. Peter tried to picture himself sleeping away while the snow lay deep over the green meadows and the Smiling Pool could smile no more because of the ice. The hard black ice would not let it. Finally, Peter could sit no longer. He just had to tell someone of his bright idea, and, well, he wasn't quite sure just what way to go to sleep and how to sleep so long, for never in all his life had Peter slept more than a very, very short time without waking to see that there was no danger near. "I'll just have to run up and see Uncle Billy Possum," said Peter. Uncle Billy Possum was sitting in his doorway in his big hollow tree in the Green Forest when Peter Rabbit came hurrying up, lippity-lippity. Peter hardly waited to say good morning before he began to tell Uncle Billy Possum about his bright idea. Uncle Billy Possum gravely listened, although there was a twinkle in his eye. "The first thing you must do is find a warm place to sleep, Brer Rabbit," said Uncle Billy. "Oh, that's easy enough," said Peter. "And then you must get fat, Brer Rabbit," continued Uncle Billy Possum. "What's that?" exclaimed Peter Rabbit, looking very much puzzled. "I say you must get fat," repeated Uncle Billy, slapping his own fat sides. "What for?" said Peter. "To keep you warm while you asleep," replied Uncle Billy. "I must get very fat?" said Peter Rabbit. "Yes, so you must get very fat indeed," said Uncle Billy Possum, and smiled, for it was hard to think of Peter Rabbit as very fat. How can I get fat?" asked Peter, and he looked just a little bit worried. "By eating and eating and eating," and in between times sitting still," replied Uncle Billy Possum. "Well, that's easy. At least the eating is," said Peter, who, you know, thinks a great deal of his stomach. "Is that all, Uncle Billy?" "That's about all, expecting you must have anything on your mind when you go to sleep, Brer Rabbit. You mustn't get worried for fear the Brer Fox is going to get you while you sleep," said Uncle Billy, grinning when Peter happened to turn his head. Peter thanked Uncle Billy and then hurried back to the old briar patch to think all over about Uncle Billy had told him. "I certainly will try it," said Peter. Chapter 24. Peter prepares for the long sleep. Day after day, Peter Rabbit ran along this way and that way over the green meadows and through the green forest as if he had something on his mind. Jimmy Skunk noticed it too. So did Billy Mink and Bobby Coon, but Peter wouldn't stop to explain. Indeed, he was always in such a hurry that he wouldn't stop at all. But when he met them, he would shout "hello" over his shoulder and keep right on running. Lippity-lippity. Uncle Billy Possum was the only one who guessed what it meant. Uncle Billy grinned as he watched Peter running about with such seriousness and important air. "Brer Rabbit is trying dreadful hard to fool himself. I reckon he's looking for a place to curl up and try to sleep all winter," said Uncle Billy. Uncle Billy had guessed just right. Peter was looking for a place to curl up and to sleep all winter. Peter was too lazy to dig a new house for himself. Then it was too late in the fall anyway. He would just find some old deserted house that of Jimmy Skunk's relatives or Johnny Chuck's relatives had given up using. So Peter went on poking into every old house that he knew of, trying to find one that wasn't so tumbled down that it would do. At last he found one that he thought would be just the place, and Peter chuckled to himself as he planned how he would curl up in the bedchamber way down at the end of the long hall. "Nobody'll ever guess where I am," he said to himself and laughed out loud. Then Peter remembered that Uncle Billy Possum had told him that it was necessary to eat a great deal so as to be very fat before going to sleep, for that was the way to keep warm until all winter. So Peter started out to grow fat. This would be fun, the very best kind of fun, for there's nothing that Peter Rabbit loves more than to fill his stomach, unless it is to satisfy his curiosity. Peter Rabbit's stomach is the thing that's most amazing. It takes so long to fill it up, his time is short for lazing. Perhaps this is the reason why, when Peter isn't eating, he wants to loaf around and watch other people work. Anyway, Peter is a tremendous eater, and now he wanted to grow fat. He felt himself that he must eat much more than ever. So when he began to eat and eat and eat and eat, but there was one very important thing that Peter forgot. He'd quite forgotten that now it's late fall, and the tender young green things at which Peter dearly loves to eat were all gone. He could no longer sit down to the sweet clover patch and fill himself to bursting. Farmer Brown had taken away all the cabbages and the carrots and the turnips and made his garden so attractive to Peter. So now Peter had to hunt for what he had to eat. That made a great deal of running around, and it was very hard work to grow fat when one runs about. The more Peter ate, the more he had to hunt for food. The more he had to hunt for food, the more he had to run about. And the more he had to run about, the more he hurried, and the faster he ran. Now, of course, running takes off fat. "Oh dear," cried Peter Rabbit, "getting fat is not as easy as I thought." Chapter 25. Uncle Billy Possum plays a joke. Some folks never seem to be satisfied or content, always wanting something more that for them is never meant. Uncle Billy Possum said this to himself as he watched Peter Rabbit hurrying about through the green forest and over the green meadows, eating as fast as he ever could so as to grow fat, that he might keep warm while he slept all winter. Uncle Billy Possum knew perfectly well that Peter couldn't sleep all winter as Johnny Chuck does, for Old Mother Nature had never planned that Peter Rabbit should. But Uncle Billy Possum knew that it was of no use to tell Peter that, for Peter wouldn't believe him. So he chuckled as he watched Peter rush around hunting for food, that actually running off that little fat that he did have, instead of putting on more. Of course, it just happened that Uncle Billy Possum was right near the old house built by Grandfather Skunk a long time ago, which Peter Rabbit had decided to sleep in all winter. It just happened that he saw Peter when he finally went down to the little bedchamber at the end of the long hall to curl up and try and get some sleep. Uncle Billy grinned, and then he chuckled. Finally he laughed until his fat sides shook. "I reckon I'm going to have some fun with Brer Rabbit," said Uncle Billy, chuckling as he trotted off through the green forest. He went over to Bobby Coon's house and found Bobby, who had just been out all night, was just ready for bed. But Bobby is always ready to play a joke, and when Uncle Billy Possum told him about Peter Rabbit and what fun it would be to give Peter a scare, Bobby scrambled up from his hollow tree right away. Then they hunted up Jimmy Skunk, and the three of them started for the old house of Grandfather Skunk, where Peter Rabbit was trying to go to sleep for the winter. "I done tell Peter that when he tried to go to sleep, he mustn't get to thinking about what would happen if Brer Fox should just hop along and find him in his sleep. I reckon that's the very first thing that Peter done think of as soon as he curled up to himself and was thinking about evermore right this blessed minute. You all's a wait and listen at the door." Uncle Billy stole very softly to the door of the old house. Then he began to grin and beckon for Bobby Coon and Jimmy Skunk to come listen. They could hear long sighs from way down in the bedchamber at the end of the long hall. They heard Peter Rabbit twist and turn as he tried to make himself comfortable. But then they heard him say a verse over and over to try and make himself go to sleep. They had to clap their hands over their mouths to keep from laughing out loud. When they grew tired of listening, Uncle Billy Possum whispered to Jimmy Skunk. Jimmy Skunk grinned and then crept a little way down the long hall and began to scratch his snout and claws as if he were digging. When he stopped, Uncle Billy put down his mouth close to the door and barked as nearly like Reddy Fox as he could. When Jimmy jumped to dig again, and pretty soon Uncle Billy barked again. Then all three stole softly away and hid behind the bushes. "I reckon Brer Rabbit is smart, wide awake instead of going to sleep for the winter," chuckled Uncle Billy. Chapter 26. Peter Rabbit Learns His Lesson. Peter Rabbit curled up in the little bedchamber at the end of the long hall in the old house made of a long time ago by Grandfather Skunk, twisted and turned and tried to make himself feel sleepy. But the harder he tried, the more wide awake that he seemed to feel. Then he began to think of Reddy and Granny Fox, and that what would happen if by chance they could find him fast asleep. And right while he was thinking about it, he heard a noise that made him jump so that he bumped his head. Peter didn't think about that bump on his head. No, sir, Peter didn't even notice it. He was too frightened. He held his breath and listened while his heart went pit-a-pat, pit-a-pat. There it was again, the noise he'd heard before. Someone was in the long dark hall. There was no doubt about it. He could hear claws scratching. Whoever it was digging, digging! The very thought made every hair on Peter Rabbit's stand on end. He knew that Johnny Chuck had gone to sleep for the winter, and he knew that Jimmy Skunk could walk right out without any trouble, and that Jimmy never takes any trouble that he can avoid. He knew that Bobby Coon and Uncle Billy Possum don't go into houses underground unless they have to get away from danger, and then very seldom. If someone was digging in the long dark hall, it could only mean one thing. That it must be someone too big to get in without making the hole larger, and that only one he could think of were Bowser the Hound, Reddy, and Granny Fox. Peter shivered and shook, for unlike Johnny Chuck's house, this one had no back door. If it's Bowser the Hound, he may get tired and go away. Anyway, I can soon tell, for he will sniff and blow sand out his nose, thought Peter, and he strained his ear to hear the first sniff. But there were no sniffs or snuffs. Instead, Peter heard the sound that made his heart almost stop beating again. It was a bark that sounded very much like a bark of Reddy Fox, and it came from just outside the door. That could mean only one thing, that old Granny Fox was digging her way into the little bedchamber, while Reddy kept watch outside. Oh dear, why wasn't I content just to live as I'd always lived? Whatever did I have to try and do something different for that I was never intended for? Cried Peter Rabbit to himself, and he shook with fright even harder. There was nothing to do but to sit still and wait. Peter sat still as he ever could. After a little while, the noise in the long dark hall stopped. Peter waited and waited, but all was still, and he began to feel a little better. Perhaps old Granny Fox didn't know that he was there, after all, and had grown tired of digging and had gone away. Peter waited a long time and then peeped into the hall. Way up at the end he could see the light where the doorway was, and by this he knew that there was no one in the hall. Little by little his heart was going pit-a-pat, pit-a-pat. Peter crept as he could peep outside. No one could be seen. With a heart almost in his mouth, Peter sprang out and started for the dear old briar patch as fast as his long legs could take him. And then he heard a sound that made him stop suddenly and sit up. Ha ha ha, ho ho ho, hee hee hee. There, behind some bushes, Uncle Billy Possum, Bobby Coon, Jimmy Skunk were laughing to fit to kill themselves. Then Peter Rabbit knew that they had played a joke on him. He shook his fist at them, but down in his heart he was glad, for he knew that he had learned his lesson, that he had no business to try what Old Mother Nature had never intended for him to do. Of course, these are not all Peter Rabbit's adventures. Oh my, no. But there are so many other little people who can live on the Green Mountain and in the Green Forest who have adventures too and get into funny scrapes that I am sure you will be willing to say goodnight to Peter for a little while and hear about the things that have happened to the others. And so, in the next book, I'm going to tell you all about the worries and troubles and exciting scrapes of one of Peter's friends, Uncle Billy Possum. The end. I hope you liked our story, boys and girls. That was our first chapter book. Go back to the beginning and listen the whole way through if you need a relaxing story time. See you next time.